In July of 2011, 28-year-old elementary school teacher Emily Carter set out on what would become a harrowing test of survival. She vanished on the Appalachian Trail in the Great Smoky Mountains, one of the densest and most treacherous regions in the eastern United States. 3 days later, when Emily failed to return, her friends contacted the police. Search teams discovered her tent, sleeping bag, and backpack hanging from a tree branch far too high for her to have placed there herself. The tracking dogs lost her scent near a massive boulder. At that moment, no one knew Emily was fighting for her life in a hidden ravine, injured but desperately clinging to hope. If you've ever wondered how you would react in a life or death situation, Emily's story will answer that question in ways you never expected. On the morning of July 20th, 2011, around 7 o'clock, Emily Carter left her apartment in Charlotte, North Carolina. She carried a moss-colored backpack on her shoulders. In the trunk of her blue Honda Civic sat a brand-new tent, a sleeping bag, a detailed map, and a thermos filled with fresh coffee. For her, this journey represented an escape from work, from noise, from the person she had become. After a painful breakup and several months battling insomnia, she desperately needed the silence only the forest could provide. She planned a 3-day trek along the Appalachian Trail through a section crossing the Great Smoky Mountains. The route was well known and frequently traveled by hikers, but the elevation changes and the density of the surrounding forest made it challenging even for experienced outdoor enthusiasts. Emily had prepared thoroughly in advance. She created a detailed schedule, checked the weather forecast carefully, and marked overnight camping spots on her map. Before departing, she called her closest friend, Jessica. The voice on the phone sounded calm and measured. She told Jessica she would be gone for only 3 days and wanted to disconnect completely from everything. Jessica asked if she was going alone. Emily confirmed she was, but assured her friend it was a short trip, and she would be perfectly fine. Those would be the last words Jessica heard from her friend for a very long time. Around 9 in the morning, Emily pulled into a gas station near the town of Gatlinburg on the outskirts of the national park. A security camera captured her pumping fuel, purchasing a bottle of water, and grabbing a small bag of mixed nuts. The cashier later remembered the young woman as friendly, composed, and showing absolutely no signs of anxiety or distress. This footage would become the last confirmed sighting of Emily Carter before her ordeal began. The road leading to the trailhead wound upward through thick fog and steep spruce-covered slopes. Another hiker, a middle-aged man from Virginia, later reported seeing Emily around 11 at an information kiosk. She stood studying a map, gazing at clouds, sliding slowly down the mountainside. She remarked that it looked like rain was approaching. He replied that the weather would likely clear by afternoon. He never saw her again after that brief exchange. But what happened next would change everything Emily thought she knew about survival. Around midday, the clouds thickened considerably, and a light rain fell across the mountains. 2 hikers walking along the lower section of the trail later stated they encountered a woman wearing a light gray raincoat. She walked quickly and confidently through the drizzle. One of them specifically remembered her calm, steady stride that showed neither panic nor fatigue. They had no idea they were watching someone walk toward a nightmare. Emily was supposed to make contact that evening. She had planned to send a brief message once she found a suitable place to camp for the night. But the cellular signal in that remote area was extremely weak. Her phone, as she would later discover, had died during the afternoon. She decided to push forward, confident she would find signal at a higher elevation point. That decision would nearly cost her everything. The rain intensified as afternoon turned to evening. Emily's boots slipped repeatedly on the wet rocks and muddy trail. She decided to set up camp earlier than planned, finding a relatively flat area beneath a cluster of tall pine trees. She unpacked her tent and began assembling the poles as rain drummed steadily against the fabric. Just as she finished securing the final stake, she heard a strange sound echoing through the trees. It resembled the low rumble of distant thunder, but felt somehow different and more immediate. Emily stood perfectly still, listening intently. The sound grew louder and closer with each passing second. Then she realized with sudden horror what she was hearing. A wall of water was rushing down the mountain toward her position. Flash flooding was a known danger in these mountains after heavy rainfall. Emily had read about it in her preparation materials, but never imagined experiencing it firsthand. She grabbed her backpack instinctively and started running uphill away from the approaching torrent. The roar became deafening as muddy water surged through the forest behind her. If you think you know what terror feels like, imagine hearing the mountain itself trying to swallow you whole. Emily ran as fast as her legs could carry her through the darkening woods. Branches whipped against her face and arms. Her lungs burned with exertion. She could hear trees cracking and falling behind her as the flood consumed everything in its path. She stumbled over exposed roots multiple times, but forced herself to keep moving forward. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet gave way completely. Emily felt herself falling through empty space. She landed hard on her back several feet below, the impact knocking all the air from her lungs. Pain exploded through her left ankle and right shoulder. She lay gasping and disoriented in total darkness. In that moment of agony, she understood how quickly everything can change. When she finally caught her breath and assessed her situation, Emily realized she had fallen into some kind of natural depression or small ravine. The walls rose steeply on 3 sides around her. Above, she could barely see the dark outline of trees against the slightly lighter sky. The floodwaters roared somewhere above and behind her, but had not reached this lower level. Emily tried to stand, but immediately collapsed as her injured ankle refused to support any weight. Sharp pain radiated up her leg with every attempted movement. She reached down carefully and felt significant swelling already forming around the joint. Her right shoulder throbbed intensely, and moving her arm sent waves of agony through her upper body. She fumbled in the darkness for her backpack, which had fallen nearby. Her hands shook as she unzipped the main compartment and searched for her flashlight. Relief flooded through her when her fingers closed around the familiar metal cylinder. She pressed the button, and bright LED light illuminated her surroundings. What she saw made her heart sink into her stomach. Emily found herself in a natural bowl-shaped depression approximately 15 feet across. Rocky walls rose about 8 feet on 3 sides. The 4th side sloped slightly upward, but was covered in loose dirt and wet leaves that would be nearly impossible to climb in her injured condition. Several large boulders lay scattered across the uneven floor. She aimed the flashlight beam upward and saw the edge of the ravine where she had fallen. Getting back up there would require climbing ability she simply did not possess with her current injuries. Emily felt the first real surge of fear rising in her chest. She forced herself to breathe slowly and think rationally about her situation. But anyone who has ever been truly trapped knows that rational thought becomes the hardest thing to hold on to. First, she needed to assess her injuries more carefully. She rolled up her pant leg and examined her swollen ankle in the flashlight beam. The joint had already turned a deep purple color. She could move her toes, but any pressure on the foot caused excruciating pain. Likely a severe sprain rather than a complete break, but equally debilitating in these circumstances. Her shoulder felt slightly better than the ankle. She could move her arm through a limited range of motion despite the pain. Probably deep bruising and strained muscles, rather than anything broken. She had additional cuts and scrapes covering her arms and face, but nothing that seemed immediately dangerous. Emily opened her backpack and took inventory of her supplies. She still had her first aid kit, a water bottle that was 3/4 full, the bag of nuts from the gas station, 2 granola bars, a small package of dried fruit, her dead phone, the flashlight, a lighter, a compact emergency blanket, and a whistle. Her tent and sleeping bag had been swept away by the flood, along with most of her other gear. Everything she needed to survive now fit in her trembling hands. She pulled out the first aid kit and found an elastic bandage. Working slowly and carefully, she wrapped her injured ankle as tightly as she could tolerate. The compression would help reduce swelling and provide some stability. She swallowed 2 ibuprofen tablets from the kit and took a small sip of water. The temperature was dropping rapidly as night settled fully over the mountains. Emily was already shivering in her wet clothes. She unfolded the emergency blanket, a thin sheet of reflective material designed to retain body heat. She wrapped it around her shoulders and huddled against one of the larger boulders that provided some shelter from the wind. Emily knew she needed to conserve her flashlight batteries. She reluctantly turned it off and was immediately engulfed in complete darkness. The silence after the flood was almost as overwhelming as the roar had been. She could hear water dripping from the rocks and her own breathing, but nothing else. If you've ever been truly alone in complete darkness, you know how the mind begins to create things that aren't there. She tried to stay calm and think through her options logically. No one knew exactly where she was on the trail. Her phone was dead, so she could not call for help. She was injured and trapped in a ravine she could not climb out of alone. The realistic assessment of her situation was grim, but Emily refused to give up hope. She was a teacher who spent her days solving problems and helping children overcome obstacles. She would approach this challenge the same way she approached everything else in her life, with determination and careful planning. She just needed to survive until someone found her. Jessica would notice when she failed to return on Sunday. Her friend would definitely call the police. Search teams would come looking for her. Emily just had to stay alive long enough for them to reach her. She mentally calculated that she had enough water for perhaps 2 days if she rationed carefully. The food would last even longer if she ate only small amounts. The night was long and miserable. Emily dozed fitfully, waking frequently from cold and pain. Every time she shifted position, her injuries screamed in protest. The emergency blanket helped somewhat, but her wet clothes continued to sap heat from her body. She shivered uncontrollably for hours. Those of you who have experienced true hypothermia know it steals more than warmth. When gray dawn light finally began to filter down into the ravine, Emily felt a surge of relief. She had survived her first night. She turned on her flashlight briefly to check her watch. 6:30 in the morning on July 21st. She should have been waking up in her tent, making coffee, and preparing for the second day of hiking. Instead, she was trapped at the bottom of a ravine with a badly sprained ankle and a bruised shoulder. But she was alive and conscious. That had to count for something. Emily allowed herself one small sip of water and a few bites of granola bar. She needed to make her limited supplies last as long as possible. As daylight strengthened, she examined her prison more carefully. The ravine was deeper than she had initially thought. The walls were not quite vertical, but were steep enough and composed of loose dirt and rock that made climbing impossible without equipment. Tree roots dangled down from above, but were too far away to reach. Emily tried calling out for help several times. Her voice echoed strangely off the rocky walls, but she doubted the sound would carry very far through the dense forest. Still, she made a mental note to call out periodically throughout the day. Someone might pass by close enough to hear. She also had the whistle from her survival kit. The sharp sound would travel much farther than her voice. Emily blew 3 short blasts, the universal distress signal. She waited and listened intently but heard nothing except bird song and wind in the trees. She would try again every hour throughout the day. The silence that answered her calls was more terrifying than any sound could have been. The sun rose higher, and a shaft of light reached down into the ravine for a brief time around mid-morning. Emily positioned herself in the warm sunlight and spread her wet jacket on a rock to dry. The heat felt wonderful against her chilled skin. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine herself somewhere safe and comfortable, but reality kept intruding on her thoughts. Her ankle throbbed with a deep, persistent ache. Her shoulder felt stiff and difficult to move. She was desperately thirsty but forced herself to take only tiny sips from her dwindling water supply. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, but she resisted eating more than absolutely necessary. By afternoon, Emily heard the sound of rain beginning again high above in the forest canopy. Within minutes, water started trickling down the walls of the ravine. She quickly positioned her empty water bottle to catch the precious liquid running off the rocks. At least she would not die of thirst if the rain continued. Small victories become everything when you're fighting to survive. The second night was even harder than the first. The temperature dropped further, and Emily's wet clothes never completely dried. She wrapped herself as tightly as possible in the emergency blanket and tried to generate body heat through small movements. Sleep came in brief, troubled intervals filled with confused dreams. On the morning of July 22nd, Emily woke to find herself severely dehydrated despite the rainwater she had collected. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her tongue felt thick and swollen in her mouth. Every joint in her body ached from lying on the hard, cold ground. She forced herself to drink several long sips of water, even though her supplies were running dangerously low. She ate the last of her granola bars and most of the dried fruit. Only the small bag of nuts remained. Emily calculated grimly that she might have one more full day before dehydration and hunger became critical problems. Where were the search teams? Why had no one found her yet? If you've ever waited for help that doesn't come, you understand the desperation that was beginning to consume her. Throughout the third day, Emily continued her routine of calling out and blowing her whistle at regular intervals. The sound echoed uselessly through the empty forest. No response ever came. She began to wonder if anyone was even looking for her. Maybe they had searched a different section of trail. Maybe they had already given up. As darkness fell on her third night in the ravine, Emily felt despair creeping in for the first time. Her body was failing. Her mind was starting to play tricks. She kept hearing voices and footsteps that disappeared when she called out. The cold seemed to penetrate deeper into her bones with each passing hour. What happens when hope begins to fade is something no one can truly explain until they've lived it. But somewhere deep inside, a stubborn spark of determination still burned. Emily remembered her students and their eager faces. She thought about Jessica and her mother, Catherine. She recalled all the small, beautiful moments of her life. She was not ready to die alone in this dark hole in the ground. Emily wrapped the emergency blanket around herself one more time. She whispered into the darkness that she would survive this ordeal. Someone would find her. She just had to hold on a little longer. With that thought, she closed her eyes and drifted into an exhausted sleep as her body fought to survive another frigid mountain night. But what was happening above ground would determine whether her fight meant anything at all. On July 25th, 2011, early in the morning, a thick haze spread slowly over the Great Smoky Mountains. The mountains seemed to breathe moisture and mist into the cool air. Everything around felt unnaturally still and quiet. Even the birds remained silent in the dense trees. That morning, the telephone rang at the Sevierville police station. A young woman's voice sounded shaky and rushed on the line. She reported that her friend had not returned from a hiking trip. Her name was Emily Carter, and she was supposed to have come home the previous day. The caller identified herself as Jessica Pearson. This marked the second time she had contacted the police about her missing friend. The duty officer responded in a flat, almost indifferent tone. He suggested waiting another full day before taking serious action. He explained that people frequently lost cellular signal in the mountains and often got delayed by weather or fatigue. But Jessica's voice carried stubborn determination beneath the fear. She knew Emily intimately and understood her habit of reporting every single detail of her plans. Emily never disappeared without sending word to someone she trusted. The officer wrote down the basic information, including the name, date, and last known location. He briefly commented to his colleague that this was probably just another case of a solo tourist getting temporarily lost in the wilderness. They agreed to investigate further the following day, if no contact was made. But the next day, the principal of the school where Emily worked personally called the police station. The teacher had failed to come to work without leaving any message or explanation whatsoever. Only then did the case receive official status as a possible disappearance. On that same day, July 26th, the first organized search team arrived at the national park entrance. 6 experienced rescuers with trained tracking dogs, 2 park foresters, and an officer from the sheriff's department assembled at dawn. They started down the trail that Jessica had indicated Emily was supposed to follow. The previous day's rain had left numerous puddles, and a heavy smell of damp moss hung thick in the air. Fog lingered persistently among the dense spruce trees throughout the morning. The sound of their footsteps was absorbed and muffled by the damp atmosphere. For the first mile of their search, they discovered only minor traces of recent human presence. They found small footprints pressed into mud, crumpled leaves along the path, and a discarded piece of plastic food packaging caught on a branch. One of the tracking dogs briefly picked up a scent trail, but quickly lost it near a large fallen tree covered in moss and lichen. In the afternoon, the search team reached a location where the trail diverged in 2 distinct directions. One path led toward Maple Falls Creek, and the other toward an old abandoned hunting shelter deep in the forest. They decided to follow the first route toward the creek, based on Jessica's description of Emily's planned itinerary. A few hundred yards beyond the fork, one of the dogs suddenly became alert and highly agitated. The animal howled sharply and stopped abruptly near a large tree with spreading branches. A moss-colored backpack was hanging from a thick branch, approximately 2 meters above the ground. The rescuers had not noticed it initially because it blended almost perfectly with the bark and surrounding foliage. One of the team members lifted a long pole and carefully removed the backpack to avoid damaging any potential evidence or fingerprints. Inside, they found Emily's personal belongings, including a first aid kit, a flashlight, a small notebook, packaged food, and identification documents. Everything appeared clean, dry, and carefully packed with absolutely no signs of struggle or hurried movement. A few steps away from that tree, they discovered something even more puzzling and deeply disturbing. On the ground beneath a bent trunk lay a neatly folded tent and a sleeping bag arranged side by side. Both items were positioned precisely as if someone had carefully inspected them before placing them down. But the location where they were placed made absolutely no sense for an actual campsite. The ground sloped steeply with gnarled roots protruding everywhere, and a dangerous ravine located mere feet away. Even an experienced hiker would never have chosen such an unsuitable and hazardous spot for sleeping overnight. The team leader, Officer Matthew Harris, wrote in his official report that the arrangement of items was completely inconsistent with the expected behavior of someone planning a normal camping trip. The scene appeared deliberately staged, rather than naturally abandoned by a confused hiker. He immediately ordered a comprehensive search of the entire area within a half-mile radius from this location. If you've ever seen something that doesn't fit the pattern, you know that feeling in your gut that something terrible has happened. By evening, rain began to cover the valley once again in steady sheets. The tracking dogs continued working until dusk, but seemed to have lost all sense of direction in the damp conditions. Finally, one of the animals picked up a faint scent trail that led north deeper into the thick forest. The rescuers followed this trail for approximately 1 hour, until the dog suddenly stopped near a large boulder covered entirely in wet moss and wild ivy growing up its sides. The dog began spinning in circles, whining anxiously, and finally lay down on the muddy ground, as if completely disoriented or exhausted. The officers walked carefully around the boulder from every possible angle, but found absolutely nothing of significance. Not a single piece of torn cloth, no shoe prints pressed into the earth, no drag marks on the wet ground. The soil surrounding the stone was packed firm, and the recent heavy rain had effectively erased any tracks that might have existed previously. That evening, the search team returned to their base camp with no concrete results to report to waiting families. In the following days, the search operation expanded significantly in scope and manpower. Numerous volunteers from surrounding communities and 2 additional groups with trained tracking dogs joined the intensive effort. Search teams deployed thermal imaging equipment, methodically combed through ravine after ravine, carefully checked riverbanks for bodies, and investigated old tourist shelters and caves. No new traces of Emily appeared anywhere in the searched area. The only detail that kept appearing repeatedly in official reports was the unnatural silence pervading the forest. Even wild animals seemed to actively avoid that particular section of wilderness. 5 days after Emily's initial disappearance, her mother, Catherine Carter, traveled from out of state to join the search efforts personally. She arrived carrying a framed photograph of her daughter clutched tightly in both hands. When rescuers showed Catherine the Ivonne recovered backpack, she could only whisper that Emily would never have abandoned her supplies voluntarily. Her daughter was too careful and too well trained for that kind of mistake. Those who have lost someone know that small details become anchors when hope starts slipping away. On the 6th day of searching, the operation was temporarily suspended due to deteriorating weather conditions. The fog became so thick that visibility dropped to no more than a few yards in any direction. The rescuers retreated reluctantly to safer ground, promising to return when the weather improved enough for safe operations. But even when the sun rose over the mountains again 2 days later, no more traces were found, despite extensive additional searching. The official report stated the search lasted 7 full days of intensive operations. The area was thoroughly examined within 3 miles of the place where Emily's items were discovered. The missing person was not found and was probably lost in a remote, inaccessible area of the park. For Jessica, these words sounded like a death sentence for her friend. She continued to call the department daily, pleading with them not to stop the operation completely, but received the same frustrating answer each time. Without new evidence or leads, authorities were essentially powerless to continue. When a week passed and then another without any sign, the mountain again plunged into its typical silence. Tourists began avoiding the area entirely, with some claiming it felt hard to breathe there or that the atmosphere felt oppressive. Local foresters quietly began referring to that section of trail as Emily's zone among themselves. She had disappeared among the ancient trees that stood motionless like silent guardians of a terrible secret. But what the searchers did not know was that Emily was still alive, barely clinging to consciousness in her hidden prison. On the morning of July 26th, the same day the official search began, Emily woke to her fourth day trapped in the ravine. Her water was almost completely gone now. Only a few precious sips remained at the bottom of her bottle. The rainwater she had collected was murky and tasted of dirt and minerals. Her injured ankle had swollen to nearly twice its normal size. The joint was rigid and hot to the touch, suggesting possible infection was beginning to set in. Her shoulder ached with a deep, grinding pain that made even breathing difficult. But worse than the physical agony was the growing fog in her mind. Dehydration and exhaustion were starting to affect her ability to think clearly and make rational decisions. Emily forced herself to blow the whistle 3 times, as she had been doing every hour. The sharp sound echoed off the ravine walls and disappeared into the forest canopy above. She waited and listened intently for any response. Nothing came back except the distant call of birds and the whisper of wind through leaves. For those of you who have ever called for help that never arrives, you understand the crushing weight of that silence. She ate 3 nuts from her small bag, chewing each one slowly to make it last. The salt made her desperately thirsty, but she resisted drinking more water. She needed to make her remaining supply last as long as physically possible. Emily estimated she might survive perhaps 2 more days before dehydration caused organ failure or unconsciousness. Throughout that 4th day, Emily heard sounds that gave her brief moments of hope. She thought she heard voices calling in the distance multiple times. She screamed until her throat was raw and bloody. She blew her whistle until her lips cracked and bled. But no one ever came close enough to hear her desperate signals. What she did not know was that searchers were indeed nearby that afternoon. At one point, a team passed within 200 yards of her location. But the ravine was hidden by dense undergrowth, and the natural acoustics channeled her voice away from their position. They heard nothing unusual and moved on to search other areas. If they had walked just 50 yards in a different direction, they would have found her. As night fell on July 26th, Emily felt herself sliding toward despair. Her body was shutting down slowly but steadily. Her thoughts became confused and fragmented. She kept seeing her mother's face and Jessica's worried expression. She imagined her students asking where their teacher had gone. The cold was unbearable now, despite the emergency blanket wrapped around her shaking frame. On the morning of July 27th, Emily barely had the strength to open her eyes. The sunlight filtering into the ravine seemed impossibly bright and harsh. Her tongue was so swollen she could barely move it in her dry mouth. Her skin felt tight and papery. Every muscle in her body screamed with cramping pain from dehydration. She tried to blow her whistle, but could barely produce more than a weak, breathy sound. Her fingers fumbled uselessly with the small plastic device. Emily realized with terrible clarity that she was dying. Her body was giving up the fight despite her desperate will to survive. Tears leaked from her eyes, but there was not enough moisture left in her body to actually cry. Emily thought about everything she would never do again. She would never teach another class or see another student's face light up with understanding. She would never hug her mother or laugh with Jessica over coffee. She would never fall in love again or take another peaceful walk in nature. All of those ordinary, beautiful moments were slipping away from her grasp. But then something shifted deep inside her consciousness. Emily remembered a lesson she often taught her students about perseverance. She remembered telling them that giving up was the only way to truly fail at anything. She had told them countless times that as long as you were breathing, there was still a chance to succeed. Now she had to practice what she had preached to those children. Emily forced her trembling hand to reach for her water bottle. She took one tiny sip of the muddy water, letting it sit on her tongue before swallowing. Then she ate one single nut, chewing it carefully despite her swollen mouth. She wrapped the emergency blanket more tightly around herself and repositioned her body to conserve as much heat as possible. She would not give up yet. Someone was looking for her. She had to believe that. Jessica would never stop searching. Her mother would never stop hoping. The school would notice her absence. Somebody somewhere cared enough to keep trying. Emily just had to survive one more day, then one more after that. When you're facing the impossible, sometimes all you can do is survive one heartbeat at a time. Above ground, the search teams were beginning to lose hope as well. On July 28th, Officer Harris held a meeting with the volunteers and professional rescuers. He explained that they had covered every accessible area within the search radius. They had found Emily's belongings, but no sign of the woman herself. The logical conclusion was that she had either fallen into water and drowned, or had wandered much farther than anyone expected. Jessica attended that meeting and refused to accept their conclusion. She stood up and spoke with fierce determination in her voice. She insisted that Emily was still alive somewhere, and they just had not looked in the right place yet. She begged them to expand the search area and try different approaches. But Harris gently explained that they had limited resources and had to make difficult decisions about where to allocate them. Catherine Carter sat silently throughout the meeting with tears streaming down her face. After everyone else left, she approached Harris privately. She asked him if he truly believed her daughter was dead. He hesitated before answering honestly that most people lost in these mountains for this long did not survive. But he also admitted that occasional miracles did happen in search and rescue operations. Those words gave Catherine the smallest sliver of hope to cling to. That night, July 28th, marked Emily's 8th night in the ravine. She had stopped counting hours and simply existed moment to moment. Her last sips of water were gone. Her nuts were gone. She had nothing left except the emergency blanket and her determination. Her body temperature fluctuated wildly between chills and feverish sweating. Her injured ankle throbbed with infected heat. Her mind drifted in and out of consciousness. Emily dreamed of water, of cold, clear streams and rain falling on her face. She dreamed of her classroom and her students' voices calling her name. She dreamed of Jessica laughing and her mother's arms holding her tight. The dreams felt more real than the cold stone pressing against her back. Somewhere in the depths of that night, Emily made peace with the possibility of dying. She thought about all the good moments of her life and felt grateful for having experienced them. She thought about the people who had loved her and hoped they would understand she had fought as hard as she could. She closed her eyes and let herself drift toward whatever came next. But fate had not quite finished writing Emily Carter's story yet. On the morning of July 29th, 2011, something unexpected happened that would change everything. A young wildlife photographer named Marcus Chen arrived at the Great Smoky Mountains to document rare bird species for a nature magazine. He had not heard about the search for Emily Carter and had no connection to the case whatsoever. He simply wanted to photograph a specific type of woodpecker that nested in remote areas of the forest. Marcus parked his truck at a different trailhead than the one Emily had used. He planned to approach the area from the north, following old deer paths that most hikers never traveled. He carried professional camera equipment, a telephoto lens, and recording devices to capture bird calls. Around 9 in the morning, he ventured deep into an area the search teams had marked as too difficult to access. The terrain was rough and heavily overgrown with thick underbrush. Marcus pushed through tangled branches and climbed over fallen logs, moving slowly to avoid disturbing any wildlife. He was searching for a specific clearing where the woodpeckers were known to feed. After about 2 hours of difficult hiking, he stopped to check his GPS coordinates and catch his breath. That was when he heard it. A sound so faint, he almost convinced himself he had imagined it. A weak, breathy whistle that barely rose above the ambient forest noise. Marcus froze and listened intently. There it was again, 3 short bursts of sound coming from somewhere to his left. The pattern was unmistakably deliberate, not a bird or animal call, but something human-made. Marcus turned toward the sound and called out. He shouted that he could hear someone and asked if they needed help. His voice echoed through the trees and disappeared into silence. He waited for a response but heard nothing for several long minutes. Then the whistle came again, slightly stronger this time, as if someone was using their last reserves of strength. If you've ever been the answer to someone's desperate prayer, you know the weight of that responsibility. He moved carefully in the direction of the sound, pushing through dense vegetation. The whistle guided him like a beacon. After about 50 yards, the ground began to slope downward sharply. Marcus slowed his pace and tested each step carefully. The whistle sounded much closer now, coming from somewhere directly below his position. Marcus got down on his hands and knees and crawled to the edge of what appeared to be a natural depression or ravine, hidden beneath layers of undergrowth and fallen branches. He peered over the edge, and his heart jumped into his throat. In the dim light at the bottom, he could see a figure wrapped in what looked like a silver blanket huddled against a boulder. He called down into the ravine, asking if anyone was there. A weak voice responded, barely audible but definitely human. The voice said a single word that made Marcus's blood run cold. Help. He immediately asked who they were and if they were injured. The voice came again, broken and hoarse. Emily. Trapped. 8 days. Marcus felt adrenaline surge through his system. He quickly assessed the situation and realized he could not climb down into the ravine safely without equipment. The walls were too steep and unstable. If he fell and injured himself, they would both be trapped. He needed to get help immediately. He shouted down to Emily that he was going to get rescue teams and would be back as soon as humanly possible. Emily's weak voice came up from the depths one more time. Please hurry. Don't leave me. Marcus promised her he would return and would not abandon her. He marked the location carefully on his GPS and took several photos with his camera to document the exact position. Then he turned and ran back through the forest faster than he had ever moved in his life. Marcus crashed through branches and leaped over obstacles, his lungs burning with exertion. He pulled out his phone as he ran but had no signal in the dense forest. He had to reach the trailhead and his truck where he could call for help. The run that had taken him 2 hours to hike took less than 45 minutes at a full sprint. When he finally burst out of the tree line into the parking area, several hikers stared at him in alarm. Marcus was covered in scratches, bleeding from multiple cuts and gasping for air. He managed to shout that he had found the missing teacher and needed emergency services immediately. One of the hikers was already dialing 911 on her phone. Within minutes, Marcus was speaking directly to Officer Harris at the Sheriff's Department. He provided the exact GPS coordinates and described Emily's condition as critical. Harris immediately mobilized every available rescue unit and called for a helicopter with medical evacuation capabilities. The response was swift and professional. Everyone who had been searching for Emily Carter sprang back into action with renewed urgency. Jessica received a phone call from Harris at 10:45 that morning. He told her they had a credible report that Emily had been found alive. Jessica broke down crying and immediately called Catherine. Mother and friend drove together to the park entrance to wait for news. Those of you who have experienced that moment when impossible hope becomes reality No, it feels like the world itself has shifted. The rescue operation was complex and dangerous. A helicopter arrived first, circling above the forest canopy, trying to locate the ravine from the air. The dense tree cover made it impossible to land or even see the ground clearly. They would need to extract Emily using ground teams with specialized climbing equipment. Officer Harris led a group of 6 rescuers, including 2 paramedics, back into the forest, following Marcus's GPS coordinates. Marcus insisted on guiding them personally, despite his exhaustion. They moved as quickly as safety allowed, carrying ropes, a rescue litter, climbing harnesses, and emergency medical supplies. The journey that had taken Marcus hours on foot took the full team nearly 90 minutes of hard hiking. When they finally reached the ravine, Harris looked down into the depression and saw Emily still huddled against the boulder exactly where Marcus had left her. She had not moved at all. One of the paramedics called down, asking if she could hear them. Emily's voice came back so weak they could barely make out her words. She said she knew they would come. She had believed someone would find her. The rescue team worked with practiced efficiency. 2 climbers rappelled down into the ravine, while others secured ropes and prepared the extraction system. The first rescuer to reach Emily was a paramedic named Sarah Mitchell. Sarah knelt beside Emily and immediately began assessing her vital signs while speaking to her in calm, reassuring tones. Emily was severely dehydrated with a weak, rapid pulse. Her skin was cold and clammy. Her injured ankle showed clear signs of infection, with red streaks radiating up her leg. She was conscious but disoriented, drifting in and out of awareness. Sarah started an IV line immediately to begin fluid replacement, while the second rescuer prepared the rescue litter. They worked carefully to move Emily onto the litter without causing additional injury. Emily cried out in pain when they lifted her injured ankle, but Sarah kept talking to her, telling her she was safe now and would be okay. They secured her carefully with straps and covered her with warm blankets to combat hypothermia. The extraction took nearly an hour of painstaking work. The team above hauled the litter up the steep ravine walls inch by inch, while the climbers below guided it away from rocks and roots. Emily remained conscious throughout, occasionally whimpering from pain, but never crying out loudly. When the litter finally reached the top, everyone exhaled in relief. The paramedics immediately continued emergency treatment, while the team prepared to carry Emily back to the trailhead. Harris radioed ahead that they had the patient, and she was alive, but in critical condition. The helicopter was repositioned to a clearing closer to their location, where they could transfer Emily for medical evacuation to the nearest hospital. The carryout took another 2 hours of careful teamwork. The rescuers rotated positions frequently, sharing the weight of the litter across the difficult terrain. Emily slipped in and out of consciousness during the journey. Sarah stayed beside her the entire time, monitoring her vital signs and adjusting the IV drip. When your life depends entirely on strangers' determination, you learn something profound about human kindness. When they finally reached the helicopter landing zone, a crowd had gathered, including Jessica and Catherine. The moment the litter came into view, both women broke down completely. Catherine tried to run forward, but Harris gently held her back, explaining they needed space for the medical team to work. Jessica stood with her hands covering her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Emily was loaded into the helicopter within minutes. Sarah climbed in beside her to continue care during the flight. Just before the doors closed, Emily turned her head slightly, and her eyes found Jessica and Catherine in the crowd. She tried to smile, but could only manage a slight movement of her cracked lips. Jessica called out that she loved her and everything would be okay. Catherine simply stood frozen, watching her daughter disappear into the helicopter. The helicopter lifted off and disappeared over the mountain ridge toward Knoxville Medical Center. The flight took 18 minutes, Emily was rushed directly into the emergency department where a trauma team was waiting. They immediately began aggressive treatment for severe dehydration, infection, and hypothermia. Emily was placed in the intensive care unit and remained there for the next 5 days. The doctors were amazed she had survived 8 days with such limited supplies and significant injuries. Her ankle required surgery to clean out the infection and repair damaged ligaments. She had lost nearly 15 pounds from her already slender frame. Her kidneys showed signs of stress from severe dehydration. But she was alive, and her prognosis was cautiously optimistic. Jessica and Catherine maintained a constant vigil at the hospital. They took turns sitting beside Emily's bed, holding her hand and talking to her even when she was unconscious. On the second day, Emily woke up fully for the first time. She saw her mother's face and whispered that she was sorry for scaring everyone. Catherine broke down crying and told her daughter never to apologize for surviving. Over the following days, Emily's condition steadily improved. The IV fluids rehydrated her body. Antibiotics fought the infection in her ankle. Physical therapy began to restore some mobility to her injured joints. She was able to eat solid food again, and her mental clarity returned completely. The doctors called her recovery remarkable, given the severity of her ordeal. Marcus Chen visited Emily in the hospital on the 4th day. She thanked him repeatedly for saving her life, calling him her guardian angel. Marcus humbly explained he had simply been in the right place at the right time. Emily insisted that his decision to investigate the whistle sound instead of ignoring it had made all the difference. They talked for over an hour and formed a friendship that would last for years. Officer Harris also visited to take Emily's official statement about what had happened. She described the flash flood, her fall into the ravine, and the 8 days she spent fighting to survive. Harris listened carefully and wrote everything down. When she finished, he told her that her determination and survival skills had been extraordinary. Very few people could have lasted as long as she did in those conditions. Emily was discharged from the hospital on August 6, 2011, exactly 17 days after she had set out on her hike. She left in a wheelchair with her ankle still in a cast, and her mother beside her. Jessica drove them home to Charlotte, where Emily would continue recovering in familiar surroundings. The physical healing would take months, but the emotional recovery would take even longer. The media coverage of Emily's rescue was extensive. Local news stations reported on the dramatic survival story. National outlets picked up the story of the teacher who refused to give up hope. Emily gave a few brief interviews, but mostly wanted privacy to heal and process everything that had happened to her. In the months that followed, Emily underwent multiple surgeries on her ankle and extensive physical therapy. She was able to return to teaching in January of 2012, though she walked with a slight limp that would likely be permanent. Her students welcomed her back with a celebration that brought tears to everyone's eyes. Emily also sought counseling to deal with the psychological trauma of her experience. She had nightmares about being trapped and alone for many months afterward. Loud sounds would trigger panic attacks. She struggled with anxiety about being in wilderness areas, but gradually, with professional help and the support of her friends and family, she learned to manage these responses. By the summer of 2012, exactly 1 year after her ordeal, Emily made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her. She announced she was going back to the Great Smoky Mountains. Not to hike alone, but to face her fears and reclaim the peace she had originally sought there. Jessica insisted on going with her, along with Marcus and a group of experienced hikers. They hiked to the area where Emily had been trapped, though they carefully avoided the actual ravine. Emily stood in the forest and took deep breaths of the mountain air. She told her companions that she had learned something profound during those 8 days. She had discovered a strength inside herself she never knew existed. She had learned that hope was not just an emotion, but a survival tool. And she had learned that human kindness, like Marcus's decision to investigate a faint whistle, could literally be the difference between life and death. Emily also visited the rescue teams and volunteers who had searched for her. She personally thanked as many people as she could find, including Officer Harris and paramedic Sarah Mitchell. She told them that knowing people were looking for her had kept her alive when she wanted to give up. Their dedication had given her reason to fight for one more day, then one more after that. In 2013, Emily wrote a book about her experience titled 8 Days, A Teacher's Journey from Despair to Hope. The book became a regional bestseller, and Emily donated all proceeds to search and rescue organizations. She began speaking at schools and community groups about survival, perseverance, and the importance of never giving up even when circumstances seem impossible. Emily never forgot the lesson that her ordeal had taught her. Life could change in an instant. Beautiful places could become dangerous. But human resilience and the power of hope could overcome even the most desperate situations. She had gone into those mountains seeking silence and escape. She had found something far more valuable, an understanding of her own strength and the profound goodness of strangers who refused to stop looking. The ravine where Emily had been trapped was marked with a small cairn of stones placed by rescue teams. It served as a quiet reminder that in these vast mountains, miracles sometimes happened. That hope was never truly lost as long as someone kept believing. And that the difference between tragedy and triumph often came down to a single moment, a single decision, a single person who chose to act when they heard a desperate whistle calling from the darkness. Emily Carter had walked into the forest as a woman escaping her problems. She had walked out 8 days later as someone who understood that survival was not just about physical endurance. It was about the unbreakable human spirit that refuses to surrender even when every rational thought says there is no chance left. Her story became a testament to that spirit and an inspiration to everyone who heard it. Because sometimes, against all odds, the story does have a happy ending. Sometimes the lost do come home, and sometimes the whisper of hope in the darkness is enough to carry you through until dawn finally breaks.